Hey everybody, thanks for joining us. We're gonna get started here. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dan Boscavelin, and I'm leading the Critical Visual Studies Symposium this semester. So we have the full schedule up here, and this same link will be functional for all of those talks. If you're interested, please feel free to drop by either in person or online. Today, I'm really pleased and excited to welcome B. Ricardo Brown, who is a professor of social science and cultural studies here at Pratt, and the author of Until Darwin: Science, Human Variety, and the Origin of Race. He's currently working on a 4-volume series for Routledge on science and race in the long 19th century, which is due to be published in 2026. And he's going to be speaking to us today about monsters and human variety from Pliny the Elder to Linnaeus' system natura. I'm going to turn it over now to Rick, and hopefully this should be the mic.
Okay.
We'll see how it
And
works.
the slide.
This thing should. There you go.
There we go. All right. So this.
So forward, back, and
Okay.
laser.
Okay. Cool. Oh, I might be able to use the
Let
laser.
me flip you around here.
Okay. Okay. Great. Well, thanks, Dan. And I'm sorry to. I'll be reading a bit because I worked on this all weekend and up until about 20 minutes ago, and so there are corrections that still needed to be made, and all of that, and also it will avoid me going off on tangents at all. So there are lots of slides though, as you'll see, and it's lots of visual things to digest. But so I apologize for reading. I try not to give talks where I read all the time, but this time this wasn't really possible. So thanks for inviting me to do this. I'm glad we're able to record it and the like so that we can share it with others. So, yeah, I want to talk a little bit about your subject, which I found very intriguing, in fact, and it made me have to sort of think about the work that I do in a slightly different way to try to incorporate, the idea of monsters and the idea of social change. So these are also kind of things I've just been kind of thinking about in the last like 2 or 3 weeks as we ran up to this, and more so over the past like week, in fact. So I'll say now there's lots of things that I'll skip over in the story that I'm telling, and lots of things I won't get to because there's just a lot. But I'll try to sort of hit the highlights for you. And so I'll start. So you asked that your speakers address the concept of monstrosity and also that of social change. And here, let me slide this down. There's your talk. there's your topic, which I found this nice illustration online somewhere where someone played around with this. So I decided to liberate it in the name of the people and for use here. Yeah, it is pretty cool. I think you can actually buy a mug with with that on it. I think that's where I found it. Yeah, so yes, you asked us that we address the concept of monstrosity and also that of social change, especially in relation to Gramsci's statement that the old world is dying and the new world is struggling to be born. Now is the time of monsters. And I appreciate the enormous challenge you've given me and the other presenters this semester. It is, as we used to say in South Carolina, quite a long road to hoe. I'll try to speak both to the problem of monsters as well as aspects of the statement that the old world is dying and the new one struggling to be born, because it seems to be a recognition that this world will be transformed, but also that the outcome of this struggle to be born is in no way guaranteed. So I hope I can raise some matters that will be of interest to you in this regard and maybe even helpful to you in your studies. Uh, so, so now let me just say that when I think about change, and we're talking about social change, it's from the perspective of Darwinian evolution within the context of materialism. There is change over time, but not change in any predetermined direction or with any particular goal. Transformations are the result of the forces of social production, the conditions of life and chance events, the things that materialists used to refer to as the swerve of the atom. This same identification of chance as an elemental aspect of nature will also be important for Marx, you'll find. And for him, chance and materialism, and particularly the materialism of Epicurus, means in fact that nothing is predetermined. And it meant, he wrote this in his dissertation, that freedom is this isn't a direct quote though, but this is his topic of his dissertation. It means that freedom is not an idea that's outside or above nature. It's actually an aspect of nature itself. So change is not only always possible, but actually change is inescapable. Alongside the many notions of social change as progress or the betterment of society lurks the monstrous aspects of modernity, slavery, colonialism, and ecological catastrophes and genocides. And in our own era, there remains the assumption, hope, wish, desire that social change is or should be progressive. This is a belief that rests on a certain knowledge of a starting point and of a certain continuity that unites us with a past that is always less, dare we say, enlightened, or at least not as knowledgeable as our own, not as technologically developed, though there's an entire other talk on the notion of technological development that we won't even go into, or that the past was less moral somehow, or somehow less good than we are, which is certainly something that gives many of us a sense of satisfaction and security in thinking through. But since we are supposed to also mention in these talks our general perspective on our work, let me say that I see my work as rooted in my studies in ecology, geography, and sociology, and in critical theory. Most of my work can be understood as attempts to trace the genealogies of systems of knowledge. Ideologies is what we might have once referred to them as. And as a sociologist, my position is that I see the social sciences not as predictive, but rather as descriptive, and when well done, critical, but without proposing a solution or even a line of flight out of the society within which we find ourselves. It is true that in situations such as Gramsci, and in a very similar sense, we ourselves find ourselves, there is a quite understandable demand that one offer a solution, a route of escape, a strategy, a plan, or even a vision of social change. But such solutions, escapes, and strategies for change are often little more than collections of aspirations and wishes that await fulfillment. And at worst, they simply reify and reproduce the existing order of domination. As Max Horkheimer, one of the founders of critical theory, stated, go to the next slide, the critical theory which I conceived is based on the idea that one cannot determine what is good, what a free society would look like from within the society which we now live in. We lack the means. But in our work, we can bring up the negative aspects of this society, which are the aspects that we want to change. So I'm not going to propose to you a way forward. That's up for you to decide. And also it's up for you to decide whether or not this work is of any use in any of those struggles or of those things waiting to be born. Now, one thing that we find in the various notions of progressive social change is a necessity that there can be or should be a break or a discontinuity with the past. And indeed, as Marx said, we cannot become children again. Quoting him from the Grundrisse. There are obvious moments of rupture, breaks, extinctions, but there are also continuities between ourselves and the past. And so I can find a little justification in the very same ideological formations that I'm mostly going to critique. And I'm going to propose to you that there is a level of genealogical continuity in the constructions of monsters that might inform our contemporary understanding of race and racialism in terms of that new world struggling to be born. Here, another slide. Yes. And so enough of that, let's turn to Pliny the Elder and how his so-called monstrous races might inform us about the origins of race and its contemporary deployment. And for those of you who don't know of him, in fact, do you know of Pliny the Elder? Have you encountered his name? No, that's fine. That's, you know, so in some circles he's widely famous, and in others, not so much. But that's true of everyone. Um, so, so if you don't know of him, I'll just mention a few things. Though his bio is interesting on many levels, and we're fortunate that his work survived the destruction brought by the coming of the Christians from the margins of the empire. He wrote several works, including a history of the Roman campaigns against the Germans, which he participated in. But sadly, the natural history is his only work that survives today. We can place Pliny the Elder in the first century of the Common Era. He was of the senatorial class and served in the legions in Germany and Africa. And in later life, he became an admiral in the Roman Navy. Now, this was this is an important position because though we often think of Roman power in terms of its legions, the fleet was vital to protect the sea routes that allowed for the constant and relatively fast movements of goods and people around the Mediterranean. It's a nice map of the major routes there. Indeed, it's been estimated that about this time or soon after, about 40% of the Roman population lived somewhere other than where they were born, which is comparable to the United States before World War II, actually. So in other words, Pliny had not only rank and status, but also direct experience of the immense scale of the empire, as well as the great diversity of its inhabitants. Let me show you a more detailed map of the Roman road system, which allowed people to move very quickly and for information and goods to be traded very, very efficiently around the empire. Pliny himself, though, lived in a villa in what's today the city of Naples, or near what's today the city of Naples. And this is a reconstruction of his villa. And it's here that he composed much of his natural history, a 37-book encyclopedia, perhaps the first encyclopedia. It was years in the making, and Pliny the Younger, the Roman names are really great. So we're talking about Pliny the Elder, but his nephew, Pliny the Younger, who he later adopts as his son, Pliny the Younger recounts in detail the intense and obsessive work regime that his uncle undertook over many years in order to complete his project. And I wish I had time to relate it to you. It's incredible. But as a result of his efforts, the natural history was completed about 75 Common Era CE. Pliny would not have long to enjoy the fruits of his efforts, though. He would be in the midst of revising portions of it when he died 4 years later during the eruption of Mount Vesuvius that buried Pompeii and Herculaneum. There's a nice illustration of it. Pliny the Younger recounts that his uncle, upon seeing the eruption, immediately began preparing his fleet to mount a rescue effort. Their repeated efforts were partly successful, as some ships were forced to turn back because of damage from the falling ash and rocks. And at some point, Pliny was informed that a friend was trapped on a nearby beachfront. It's another illustration of the catastrophe. Pliny the Elder directed his ship to go to their rescue. And when his crew questioned the wisdom of this, for good reason, as you can see, even in an artistic depiction, his crew was a little unnerved by this. When they questioned the wisdom of this and implored him to turn back, he replied with the phrase that is perhaps his other contribution to posterity: "Fortune favors the bold." So he managed to land his ship, find his friends, but was trapped there by the changing winds. While waiting for the winds to shift, Pliny was overcome by the fumes and had a heart attack, or we're not really sure, but he died on the beach there. According to the historian Suetonius, Pliny not only did he go ashore, but he only went ashore to see the volcano up close and took a slave with him, instructing the slave to kill him if the eruption threatened to overwhelm them. As with so much in the past, we cannot really be sure of what happened. It was possible both there are elements of truth in both Pliny the Younger and Suetonius's accounts. About 100 years ago, the remains of a person whose dress was consistent with that of a Roman admiral was actually found on the beach. And recent analysis has indicated that they were the remains of a 40 to 50-year-old Roman from central Italy, and that they also contained the remains of a person probably about 30 from North Africa. Many people rush to say this is obviously Pliny, and it's unclear if this person was a soldier or a slave or perhaps both. And this is at least a story of these remains that some people hope to be true, but we'll have to wait to see if there's further proof of this. And it is a pretty good story, actually, too. But the reason Pliny is important for us in our understanding of monsters is his natural history. This encyclopedic work survived and continued to be used and preserved for many centuries to come, providing one of the early foundations for natural history. Here is what Rackham, the translator of the Loeb edition of Pliny, writes of him. Yes, he is diligent, accurate, and free from prejudice. Though he had no considerable first-hand knowledge of the sciences, no one did at the time. It's not like a big slight. No first-hand knowledge of the sciences, and was not himself a systematic observer. He had a naturally scientific mind and an unaffected and absorbing interest in his subjects. If he gives us as much attention to what is merely curious as to what has an essential importance, this curiosity has evidently preserved much valuable detail, especially as regards to the arts. Moreover, anecdotes that used to be rejected by critics as erroneous and even absurd have now in not a few cases been corroborated by modern research. The book is valuable as an anthropological document. It's a storehouse of scattered facts exhibiting the history of man's reaction to his environment. And he gives us insights into how we organized our knowledge of the natural world, at least up until the time of Darwin's Origin of Species, when that opened up space for new fields of knowledge like biology and ecology. Slide of the contents, hopefully you can see that. Now, obviously, within these 37 books, it's right, there is a wealth of information, as you can see from this chart of the table of contents. The topics cover everything from the actual shape of the earth and climate, to geology, to the correct ingredients for paint, to the correct stones to use for your sculptures, plants and their medicinal qualities. It's really an impressive work by any measure, and it does have a certain organization to it, despite what Rachman said. It's book 7 that actually will concern us tonight. Book 7, and these are, I have a bunch of these that's long, so I'll only show a couple of them. Book 7 is one where the later commentators will variously call the book on the monstrous races, or sometimes the prodigious races. But these are not terms Pliny used. In honor of him, some refer to them now as the Plinian races, and indeed most of them are recognizable by us as monstrous, even as monsters that still frequently appear in our own popular culture. Now let's go down a little bit more. You see some more of their Pliny's actual wording is not races of humans, and certainly not monstrous races. Instead, he refers to the tribes of man, or the tribes of humans, united and yet also of almost infinite variation. So much so that, he says, that no work such as his would be able to express it, nor a single human mind able to grasp it as a whole. These tribes of humans comprise all those that he has not mentioned in the previous 6 books as he described the various nations and city-states of the globe and their characteristics. Skip through a couple of these. We'll come back to them perhaps later on. There are about 75 of these races, some of which you'll recognize, some not, some that are fanciful, all of which he says he has on good authority or has seen himself, or knows people who have seen them. And in fact, once he mentions, he actually is the source for these two. Uh, and notice that races here, because he doesn't use the term, these are tribes. There's not necessarily a physical characteristic that distinguishes them. The Harpi are simply people who walk on logs without being burned, and they're exempt from military service, as opposed to the Ethiopians who are more than 7 feet 6 inches tall. And he says, I've seen them. I was in Africa. I met lots of Ethiopians. They're all really, really tall. And they rarely suffer from headaches and toothaches, which is interesting too. Just as an aside, one of the things apparently that distinguishes people from Pompeii and Herculaneum is the quality of their teeth, because there was natural fluoride in their water from the volcano. So it was actually like, oh, you must be from there. You're looking good. We'll come back to more of this, and we'll see some nice pictures of them too in a bit. This is how he describes what he's going to do. And indeed, I gave the tribes of humans in my telling of the kinds of nations in the first 6 books. And I will not at this time give examples of the rights and morals, which are too numerous to manage in this work, and are nearly as many as the groupings of humans. Truly, nature, powerful and majestic in its momentous whole, lacks real weight if one considers only its parts and not the complex spirit of the totality. Our shaking, undulating fear of tigers, panthers, peacocks, of the spots and colorings of so many living creatures calls to mind a common truism, but one of immense value. So many ways of speaking, so many languages, so great are the varieties of eloquence, the barbarian cannot pass through here in the place of a civilized person. It says, now onto the face, and the features there are in common only 10, and perhaps a few more parts. But there are no 2 likenesses existing in so many thousands of humans that they cannot be distinguished. Something no art might construct in such an abundance and from so small a number of parts. He actually finds, twins really, really interesting, and gives an account that he thinks is the most interesting one, of someone swindling an emperor by convincing them that these 2 kids were twins when in fact they weren't, but they looked a lot alike. And he's like, that's really interesting that you could actually have them look that much alike. So one thing, he's like, in his terms, there's infinite variety, very much so amongst humans. So let's look at the various other tribes of humans. And I did give you a chart before, but I'll give you some slides of them now. And this isn't really complete, nor is the chart complete, as Pliny himself says. These are some of the depictions from later works, because as I said, Pliny's work survives and is used throughout the next 500, 600, 700 years, even more, even until today. I mean, it's actually really, really an interesting text. Again, like if you're interested in things like sculpture and painting, he has a lot to say about how it's done and what you should use, for just in sort of passing. These are some of the ones that I picked out from that long list of that I showed you before. And these are the characteristics of them that he relates along with the depictions from later works. Some of them you'll notice, some of them seem quite odd. The ceopods, the umbrella foots that lie on their back and hold their foot up in the air to shade them from the sun. What's interesting about Pliny is that he's like, well, there are all these, look at these faces. You put all these combinations together and you get all these different types of people, right? You don't have to just do that with faces. You could do that with other parts of the body. And you could have this infinite variety of different kinds of people. And one of them would be people with one leg with a giant foot that they can use to shade themselves from the sun. That doesn't seem weird. And in fact, I have it on good authority from people who have traveled to India that they have seen people who are doing exactly this. So he's not being fanciful in his view these days. Here's another one. Who I've actually, you might notice sometimes in horror films, you'll find some of these very same beings suddenly appearing. So they haven't really gone away, even though we say it plenty is in the past. Ethiopians, the Indians and Ethiopians again that I mentioned that Pliny is actually the authority on. He says he did serve in Africa in the legions, so it is probably true that he saw and met plenty of people from Ethiopia and India, though to a Roman, Ethiopia and India is kind of everything over there, right? So some of it's kind of south, so that's kind of Ethiopia. If it's not down there, then it's over in India, and that's just kind of how they view things. So there's always a slippage when they say that. It's sort of like, yeah, at the edge. Here. And there's another depiction from, I'm sorry, the 13th century. And this one is actually a pretty interesting one because it's someone with a three-sided face. Because again, Pliny, that's not mentioned in Pliny's works. Others later on are adding in more of the tribes of humans as time goes on, the work is done and redone over time. This is actually my favorite, or one of my favorite ones. They're the apple smellers. Found in India near the origins of the Ganges River, mouthless, hairy all over, but wear garments, live by smell, neither eat or drink, but smell flowers, fruits, and especially apples. They die if they smell a bad odor. I guess so, good people, nice people, harmless, not bothering anybody. They just like to sit and smell. When he describes in that longer chart, pygmies, he says pygmies live in India and they too don't eat. They too live by smell. And he thinks, and we know pygmies exist, right? So again, why could we not have these also existing for us? Here, a couple more for you. The all ears who are found in the mountains of India. Again, everybody's found there. Usually, there are people. He calls them. He says Cicero is the authority for this. Double-eyed women with four pupils. He says they live in Rome, and it's a bad thing if they look at you, because bad things happen to you. But he says, well, I don't really believe bad things happen to you. But Cicero says they live in Rome, so one wonders who Cicero was really referring to when he said that. But these other ones, and you'll find them too. Let me get for a second. In medieval sculptures and in cathedrals and churches, you'll find them lining the walls or lining the entrances. Being often, these are all the children of God, even these people over here, even though they're not us. A couple more troglodytes, you've heard that word before. They simply live in caves and they lack speech. Notice there's nothing very much about color, none of the things that we normally associate with race, here, but there are characteristics of each of these tribes, and these are the fundamental characteristics of each one. There's a couple more. You find them all, the one with the giant hand. So why not? It's another combination. So I'll stay with that one. So Pliny doesn't refer to these people as monstrous races, and he also doesn't share our notion of race. A Roman of his time, and this is certainly true of Pliny, would not understand human differentiation and difference in terms of our notion of race. Roman authors make almost no mention of skin color, for example, which we would often make reference to almost immediately. And so we owe our construction of race as a domain of the monstrous mostly to ourselves. And here's something from a few years ago in Time magazine. And we're very clever people, aren't we? We've created this idea of race. But go to this next one. But it's true that the monstrous mark the boundaries of the social order, but the monstrous are not outside of that order. Instead, they emerge from within it. Wherever we are, there are monsters because we are the monsters we create. As Pliny says at the start of Book 7, his book on the tribes of man, to one species of living beings sorrow has been given, to one excess, and indeed in countless ways for each body part, he's including sexual excess there, to one ambition, to one greed, to one an immense desire to live, to one superstition, to one care for burial, and even concerns for the future after one's own time. No creature has a more fragile life. No creature has a greater desire for all things. No creature has a more disordered fear. No creature has a more intense rage. Finally, other animals live according to their kind. We see them gather and stand united against those unlike them. The ferocity of lions does not cause battle amongst them. The bite of serpents does not seek other serpents. Even sea creatures and fish do not act violently, except towards other species. But by Hercules, for humans, many evils come from other humans. So actually, pretty modern thinking, I would say. Pliny's natural history continues to serve as the basis for those many encyclopedic works that we could see those images coming from. And there is an interesting connection between him and Augustine too, who says that he has not observed the Plinian races or the monstrous races, but he has read Pliny. He knows about this question, and he wants to make plain actually that these, if they do exist, are not outside of the plan of creation. And that's a pretty interesting sort of read on that, which I have sort of in detail here, but I'll skip some of that to just read you, hopefully, when he's talking about Pliny. Augustine reminds his reader that there's no reason to believe that the ancient authorities who had to rely on the accounts of others, like Pliny. Surely it would be easy to encounter an ape, monkey, or sphinx and mistake them for men rather than as beasts known in his own time. Suppose, Augustine speculates, that God created these monstrous races in the same manner that he creates individual monstrosities. And this is to quote him. Accordingly, it ought not seem absurd to us that as in individual races there are monstrous births, so in the whole race there are monstrous races, unquote. Augustine does not want to attempt to give a final answer, though, on whether or not these are humans, and he instead says he concludes cautiously and guardedly by suggesting three possibilities to the problem of whether the monstrous varieties of man exist. Either they don't exist, which is the first one. The second is, if they do exist, they are not humans, but beasts. Or third, if they do exist, then they are actually humans, and they are descended from Adam like all other humans, which is actually in keeping with what Pliny sort of said. Partly, I think one of the reasons Pliny's work survived was not just because it has so much useful information, but there are things about it that the Christians could go like, yeah, okay, we can go along with that. Like we don't need to burn that one. It might be useful to us later on. Yes. So over the next centuries, we find the tribes of humans appearing still on the various maps of the world, but always at the margins of those maps. and there's a woodcut that could be from either the 14th century or a 19th century copy of it. Unfortunately, again, to trace the encyclopedias and the influence of Pliny through the period before the Enlightenment would be an enormous task, and it's been done far better than I could do in these brief remarks. However, there is an increased emphasis on viewing monsters and monstrosities as divergent forms of human, something we actually is in Augustine. And that's a notion articulated by him, just as, again, individual monstrosities might be produced from monstrous births. So too, a deity might produce monstrous races of humans and populate the earth with them. Other slide. It's not difficult at all to move from this position to the notion that in a world created by a deity, wherein the species and their characteristics are fixed and unchanging, that monsters could become seen as different and separate creations or species, whose status as human was uncertain. This is a map again showing, a map of the world showing the Pliny's tribes of humans down here. They're actually here in the corner. They move to the margins of the medieval maps all the time, and you'll see them lurking there quite frequently. The infinite variation of nature that Pliny recognized has been was put aside, and as tribes of humans become the monstrous races of man, who are, like all other human races, fixed in their characteristics and classifiable within a larger book of nature. Show you another version of that. This is indeed a distinguishing characteristic of the study of natural history in the 18th and 19th centuries, at least until the publication of The Origin of Species. To the next one. I'll give you a better, yeah, that's a good view. One thing that separates Pliny from the later natural historians, though, is that he's a compiler and accumulator of knowledge. While this is organized by topics and material, there's no attempt to present a system or a comprehensive view of nature. In fact, we heard him say it's not within the capabilities of a single mind to be able to do that. And after all, he began by stating exactly that, like I said, and he believes that as a good Stoic, he wants to hold on to some notion of the gods, though he doesn't want to make the nature simply systematic and fixed. So here's a nice quote from him in this regard. That's another nice map of the and actually you see down here some other things we might recognize, like a unicorn, along with everyone else. Yeah, I added tons here. I'll put all these slides online for you, so you'll be able to just look at them at your leisure, because there's a bunch of things here, and I have plenty more of these as time goes on. But this quote of Pliny's: "The world in this, whatever other name men have chosen to designate the sky, whose vaulted roof encircles the universe, this world is correctly thought of as noumen, eternal, immeasurable, having no beginning, and which is never to perish. Whatever is outside of this world does not concern men to explore, since the human mind cannot even think of conjectures about it. It is sacred, eternal, immeasurable, completely in itself, finite and resembling the infinite, certain of the number of the order of all things, and resembling the uncertain, holding all that is without and within, at once the work of nature and nature itself." So I think it's a nice quote from him. Here's his contents again. Pliny never attempted to establish this system of nature. The other tribes of humans are not deviations, degenerates, or deformities, nor are they the result of hybridization. They are not signs or omens or representations of divine favor or wrath. This is a fundamentally different conception of human variation than the one we basically deploy today. And here. But not so, Pliny wasn't interested in creating a system of nature, but not so Linnaeus, whose book is The System of Nature, as opposed to natural history. Pretty starkly telling you what's going on here. and especially those who follow him, we're not interested in the type of work Pliny did. They were interested in doing a systematic understanding and gaining a systematic understanding of nature. Um, and he presents us with the idea that nature's can be summarized in a fixed table of classifications, which is still the basis for our descriptions of the order of the natural world. We recognize distinct species, we identify them with two Latin or Latinized names, we organize them into a scheme of species, genus, genera, family, kingdom. This is to Pliny. This is literally the table of nature. This is the system. It's not a huge book. It's actually quite short. Well, the first ones are. It gets bigger as time goes on. But originally, it literally is just a chart. Here's all of nature, all organized. Plug it in, plug your set in, and you know where it is. This is incredibly important at the time, and I wish I could go into that, but that would be a whole course in and of itself. A course I used to teach a few years ago. Um, like I would, but given all that, I would argue that this new natural history of Linnaeus is distinct from Pliny's version because it emerged alongside and within the social relations of capital, which consisted of slavery, industrialization, or wage slavery, as Marx said, imperialism, colonialism, all of these with their various structures and techniques of regulating populations. And so the legitimacy of natural history in its later form rested on its ability to provide a systematic understanding of the diversity of nature and of humans within a framework that was rational, fixed, and unchanging. If I'm going to colonize someplace, I need to know the species there. I need to know that when I, Linnaeus, am looking at a specimen in Sweden, that my student who collected that specimen in the Amazon, that we're talking about the same thing, right? And so we have to have this system so that we can know what we're all talking about. And it's okay because the world is fixed in its places and its components. So part and parcel with colonialism, imperialism, and the rest arises this need to classify, and especially too to classify humans and to understand why humans are different from each other. Pliny's just fine. Look, people look different. Look at these ski pods. They just, everybody looks different. Not so when we get to this point in history, about 1740 or so. In keeping with things you might know about American history and things that are happening around that time here and the like. This is all happening too. Thomas Jefferson actually says that he's a disciple of Linnaeus, and he follows Linnaeus in all of his natural history, writings and the like. So that's a very nice letter about that. So just to spend a little time with the Linnaean system and how it might inform us about these monsters in race today. Here's I can say Linnaeus places, this is from the second edition, but it's also in the first too. Linnaeus is really the first person to place humans in the order of nature. Right? It doesn't, we're not outside of it, we're actually a part of nature. We may not be connected genealogically to everybody, that's all the others, that's unclear, but we are certainly a part of nature itself. And he's the first to really classify humans in the ways in which we might understand humans today. So this one here, oops, I didn't mean to do that. I went backwards. Sorry about that. Press the wrong button. This is his original classification of humans in the system of nature. It's pretty simple. There are four types of humans. There are white Europeans, there are red Asians, there are yellow Asians, there are red Americans, and there are black Africans. And that's pretty much it. So this is really, one of the really interesting things is that it's not detailed at all. It's just like, yeah, there's this scheme. And some might even say, okay, what's the problem there? This is a better view of it, actually, for you here. We know ourselves. We have four front teeth, or maybe none. we have these four different divisions. This is in the first and second edition. By the time we get to the 10th edition, which is the last one that Linnaeus worked on, we see it as much more detailed. And we start to see some of the things that we might notice in our own understandings of race and racialism. They're familiar. The Americans are ruled by customs. They like to paint themselves with fine lines. There are all these anthropological aspects to the descriptions now of the different races, as opposed to, yeah, you just live on this continent and you're this color, and that's enough. Now we have to have actually much more. And it starts to sound like a certain hierarchy, right? Americans are ruled by customs. Europeans are governed by laws. They also like to wear close-fitting clothes. Asians are ruled by opinion, and Africans are just ruled by whim, priests. So we can already see this hierarchy sort of emerging, even though he's not actually going to claim that that exists. Yes, his description of Africans is pretty offensive, actually. Women are without shame and they lactate profusely. How the evidence for this we don't have, but he seems to know, and I'll mention a little bit later about how Linnaeus goes about his work. But over time, and as he became more prominent, and his students traveled around the world, he stayed pretty much in Sweden, but he sent his students out to collect specimens for him, and people would just want to be recognized as being a part of the process, so they would send specimens to Linnaeus, hoping he would identify them. So therefore they can say, well, I'm in there, And that happens throughout the 18th and 19th century in natural history. Everyday people are just like into it, because none of these people are technically scientists in the way that we think of today. So they're all without portfolio, or amateurs, one might say. So, but again, we see in this, and we see in his scheme, that by this part of this time in the 10th edition, in 1758-59, that we have a very different understanding of the system of nature and the place of humans and their differences in the system of nature. Go to this one. We also have, though strangely, monsters haven't completely gone away, because, and maybe not so strangely, because if Linnaeus does mark sort of a transition, we would expect to find some holdovers, in his account. And indeed, in the 10th edition, there are monsters listed at the end. He says that they exist. They're not the paradoxes, which he will also say, these are things like hydras and unicorns and things like that. I don't believe those things exist. He actually doesn't think barnacles really exist either, or at least he thinks they're so puzzling, I don't know where to classify them. I don't know what these things are. So let's just forget it. So it's a whole list of the paradoxia. But with the monstrous, he does actually put them there still with the humans. They're the Alpini, who are small, childlike, agile, fearful. They live in the Alps. There are the others too. They're the Hottentotti, who are the Hottentots, who are humans, right? They're people in Africa. At this time, though, and especially with Linnaeus and his students, they see the Hottentots as almost like missing links between apes and humans. They're partly human, they're partly ape, and that's how they identify them. So there's also the coneheads of China and the flatheads of Canada. Probably First Nations peoples who flatten the heads of their kids with boards. And then one of his students then comes up and goes like, look at that. That's amazing. And it's just it's a custom of those people, absolutely. And Pliny will have just probably said, yeah, that's some custom that they have. But for Linnaeus, it's like, no, it's a whole completely different species of human being there. But again, I think what's kind of important is that the monstrous races don't actually completely disappear, even at this point of time. It's only a little bit later that they do. It's with the work of Blumenbach Now, Blumenbach was a follower of Linnaeus, and it's he that really completes the mutation of the monstrous into the racialized. For while Linnaeus gives us the classification based initially on geographic areas and color, Blumenbach is the person who gives us our contemporary classification of race, one that remains in use in our everyday life and even in our current census categories. Go directly trace back to there. So this is, yeah, actually, let's stop there for a second. This is Blumenbach's classification. It might be very familiar to us, and words that we might recognize, like Caucasian. There, Ethiopians again show up. We remember them from before. Mongolian, American, Malayan. So there are now not 4, but there are 5. They have specific geographical locations or points of origin. To some naturalists, they are classified by color, and they also have particular characteristics. You might notice that the Caucasian's characteristic is simple. It's simply beautiful in form. There's not much else to say about that, and he has good reason for saying that. We'll find out. He termed he coined the term Caucasian to describe Europeans, actually, and he does it based upon this skull, this cranium of a woman from Georgia. What's now not our Georgia, the other Georgia out there in the Caucasus. And this is a sketch by Blumenbach. Blumenbach kept the skull with him all the time, usually sitting on his desk, so that he could gaze upon it because he thought it was beautiful. And it's, beautiful in all forms. On the side, you see a comparison between the European and the negocrania in Blumenbach. But the perfection of the crania, he thought, was in this Georgian crania. And you can see, too, in this portrait here of Blumenbach, there's the skull again. It does appear all over the place. Now, I should say a couple of things about him, just as an aside. That Blumenbach was not necessarily trying to be a racist. In fact, he wasn't trying to do that at all. He was trying to show that humans are all one species, and though we vary over time and place, that we remain one species. This was actually kind of a controversial view at the time that he's doing natural history. And so he wants to account for the appearance of differences while still keeping everyone the same species. He does this in a couple of ways. One is he presents it in 2 starkly different ways. One is sort of a hierarchy with the European at top and the others diverging on the side, but the other, which is the horizontal, where the European's in the center, and everyone else is just sort of, it's not so hierarchical in that regard. Blumenbach believes that we're all one species, except that we look different because of climate, because of food, and because other races have degenerated from the European form, which was the norm. So as you move further and further away from Europe and over time, you look less and less like a European. And that's why we have these, and you go into a different climate, you have different looking people. It's not, of the time, it's not necessarily a crazy idea for him to have, and it's certainly better than some of the ideas that some others had at the time. And he's certainly not saying, God created all of these 5 different, people, and they're just stuck the way they are, and they're just different races. So he's really trying to go against that particular idea, but ironically, he does give us the racial classification that we have today. And to the point, I should say that Blumenbach, for all that he did give us this, he had one of the largest collections of African and Black American writing in Europe, and he delighted in bringing, when people would say, oh, these Africans are incapable of doing anything, he would bring them into his library and say, well, they wrote all these books. what do you think about that? He's people are complicated even back then. So nobody's necessarily just good or bad. But what Blumenbach was engaged in was trying to weather a dispute going on. Natural history was divided at the time between those who believed that the varieties of humans were the same species, such as him, but different populations that diverged from each other. These people were called the monogenists. They were opposed by the polygenists, who were those who believed that humans were composed not of different populations, but of different species, that each race was a different species. And these races, and the number of races was always in dispute. It could go from 5 or 6 to 185. I've seen that whole range, depending on how detailed you want to get, or the researcher wanted to be about this. That these were all created at different times in different places, and that they were indigenous to the specific places where they emerged. And that Europeans emerged first in Europe. They're native to Europe, they're indigenous to Europe. Africans emerged last. They're the most primitive, partly because of that. They've had less time to develop. But they are not the same species as Europeans are. Let me say that that sounds pretty terrible, and it is, because polygenism was the dominant view that natural historians had at the time, and polygenism was obviously a pretty good justification for slavery and all sorts of other things. If I know these people are not people but different species, then I'm completely justified. And I'll come to that in a little bit later. But actually, no. I'll just say polygenism dominated in part because it provided an explicit justification for slavery, especially in the United States, where it was widely accepted by naturalists such as Samuel Morton and Josiah Nott. He's come down here to this guy, and he was an interesting fellow. There's a lot of controversy about the crania collections. They're in Philadelphia and in the University of Pennsylvania. Those are his collections. He had the largest collection of crania in the world at the time. And this fellow, Josiah Nott, I'll come back to him and them in a minute, who was an important naturalist and physician, whose book, who actually published translated the essay on the inequality of the human races, and helped write the book Types of Mankind. So let me go back to the one before. So this idea of indigenous, actually, we use it quite a lot, and it seems to be kind of a progressive idea at this particular time, but it originates actually in the idea in polygenism, that we are 5 different species, and to call a group of people indigenous means that they are not connected to you. They are a different species than you are. And this book, actually done by Nott and Glidden after they did Types of Mankind, was literally titled "The Indigenous Races of the Earth," and some of the characteristic races of the Earth that they proposed to illustrate to us. So it wasn't an explicit justification for slavery, and one can say that if all races were separate creations, then slavery, as that guy Aristotle noted, was something natural. And then it was, of course, natural to enslave and subjugate any and other lesser races or species of humans in the world. So, go to this. Morton did a book on the crania of Egypt, all of which were stolen, many of which were stolen by Glidden while he was a consul in Egypt and sent to Morton, so he could become friends with Morton, actually. There are Types of Mankind, which is actually the premier work though, of polygenism is the one to sort of think about and to examine a bit more. A number of noted natural historians contributed to this, including Louis Agassiz, whose name still remains in high regard amongst naturalists and scientists today. And he actually created a map for the types of mankind to show the locations of the indigenous races of the world, each race associated with a certain place and certain other fauna. Even because they're all followers of the French naturalist Cuvier, he actually uses Cuvier's portrait as the exemplar of the European in this work. There's the larger chart that they used there. So these are the various types of humans, again, all completely separate species from each other. So I think that you might want to say that when, you might want to think about using the term indigenous when you use it sometime, just to remember that it might be a perfectly good word and a term that's been reworked, but it does have its origins where we might not like it to be. I actually never used the term, especially since I discovered that the Canadians use the term First Nations and First Peoples. I think that's much better, than the term indigenous. I've just studied this stuff for far too long to be able to do that. Now, I go down. That's the map. Again, that's an outline of the map so that you can see better the different regions of the different types and races of man. Agassiz was the leading critic of Darwin amongst naturalists after The Origin of Species was published. Agassiz was convinced that everything was made by a deity according to a plan of creation. And so though he's widely received, he never varied from that. He also, was very happy to have people photograph slaves for his work and force them to do all sorts of things. And he wasn't a good guy. He came to the United States because he was so in debt he had to get the hell out of Europe and get here. So, but he went to Harvard and everything worked out fine as time went on. So, as I said, polygenism, dominated the view, and the polygenic view that we were at least 5 different races, meaning 5 different species, was the dominant one from Linnaeus to Cuvier. And its ability to fix knowledge of the natural world was only displaced by Darwin's Origin of Species, which provided the first truly scientific argument for monogenism by combining genealogical descent with continuous change over time. To quote him, Darwin, descent being, in my view, the hidden bond of connection which naturalists have been seeking under the term natural system. So Linnaeus never got that everything on the chart was actually genealogically connected. Darwin's like, no, all those things are connected to each other. They're not separate out. You can't do that. He also, if things aren't fixed, well, you can only have a complete classification of the species of the world if you fix their characteristics. If they're constantly changing, then you can't have that fixed classification, right? So Darwin's like, this system's going to fall apart because it just can't, and it already was falling apart. It just couldn't handle the enormous numbers of new species that was being demanded of it to identify and to classify. So Darwin writes this in The Descent of Man to talk about what his real goal perhaps was in this work. And it actually was to intervene into this dispute between the monogenist and the polygenist. Whether primeval man, when he possessed but a few arts, and those of the rudest kind, and when his power of language was extremely imperfect, would have been deserved to be called man, must depend on the definition which we employ. In a series of forms graduating insensibly from some ape-like creature to man as he now exists, it would be impossible to fix on any definite point where the term man ought to be used. But this is a matter of very little importance. which is why I just spent all that time in, right? You know, like, oh, not really that important, but I just thought I'd mention that. So again, it's almost a matter of indifference whether the so-called races of man are thus designated or ranked as species or subspecies, but the latter term appears the more appropriate. Finally, we may conclude that when the principle of evolution is generally accepted, as surely it will be before long, the dispute between the monogenist and the polygenist will die a silent and unobserved death. So, yeah, my work will destroy that. We can only see that humans are one species. Remember, Darwin's a committed abolitionist. He's seen slavery in Brazil, and his son Francis says that during the rest of his life, Darwin would frequently wake up at night having nightmares about what he experienced in Brazil. So it had a huge effect on him. You could not even entertain the idea that slavery might be in some way okay, like, well, we're helping civilize people or something like that. Darwin would like fly into a rage and faint. He would get so upset, right? According to the people who knew him. So yes, you know, we can actually think of the and I argued this until Darwin. That in some ways we can think of The Origin of Species as a great work of abolitionist literature. That's really what he was attempting to do. So go to this. So monsters have left the scene except in our imaginations and popular culture. Or I could say, or did they? We know we see them in popular culture, but I also like to note that our former President Donald Trump, it's hard to mention his name in these contexts, but yes, frequently lashes out at thugs and radical left monsters who he says attack him all the time, and who he believes are not marginalized enough in our society. And as I said at the start, it's true that the specters of the monstrous mark the boundaries of the social order, but the monstrous are not outside of that order. Instead, they emerge from within it. Wherever we are, there are monsters because we are the monsters we create. And I'll stop here because I don't want to overwhelm you, and I probably already have, but I'll leave you with this little remark by Mr. Marx. The French bourgeoisie had a long time ago found the solution to Napoleon's dilemma, the dilemma being in 50 years, Europe will be Republican or Cossack. It solved it in the Cossack Republic. No Circe using black magic has distorted that work of art, the bourgeois republic, into a monstrous shape. That republic has lost nothing but the semblance of respectability. Present-day France was already contained in the parliamentary republic. It required only a bayonet thrust for the bubble to burst and the monster to leap forth before our eyes. So maybe I should have mentioned, maybe it's good that I mentioned Donald Trump, actually. So that's all I have for you. There's lots and lots I've left out, and I was trying not to overwhelm you with it, but hopefully you saw a little bit there of a big and complex topic that I've spent many, many years working on, and I'm still learning, about as we go along. So.
Thank you so much, Rick. That was
Okay.
amazing. You're getting lots of claps on Zoom right now.
Oh, thanks.
From people as well, little emoji claps. So happening in person here too.
Yeah.
So I'd like, I guess, we have about 25 minutes if we'd like.
Sure.
I don't want to keep you too long.
I didn't get my water.
For questions and comments. And I will open that up both to people on Zoom and here in the room. But what I'm going to ask folks to do is I'm going to pass this phone around, which is our microphone as well, so that people on Zoom can hear you. Anybody have any questions or thoughts for Rick about it? There's a lot here, so. Yeah.
It's more based on writing. It's more based on writing. I noticed there's in the conclusion part from the book, there's a discussion of the concerns raised by robots. And based on the recent debate on AI such as ChatGPT, and conversely, the AI that detects what what like the art or the works were being AI generated. Can this be seen as a kind of decoding to similar racial assumptions, like to identify?
You mean in the article I said?
Yeah.
Yeah. I have to think about that. Well, certainly, there's the one thing I didn't deal with AI at the time I wrote, because I actually, though it was published not so long ago, it was written like 2 years before that, so I wasn't really dealing with AI. It is interesting to consider AI in relationship to these questions about whether it's conscious, how do we deal with it and associate with it, whether it should have rights, but we also do that with other animals too. At the same time, should primates also have rights, and whales and other animals too. So now I've lost my train of thought. So shoot, because I'm fast running through all the things that the implications of what you asked. So tell me again, what was that last part? Yeah.
It's like how we see like AI like ChatGPT, and
Mm-hmm.
conversely the AI that detects ChatGPT
Mm-hmm.
is seen as a form of decoding the similar racial assumptions.
Sure. Decoding them in the meaning of like of dismantling them,
Like
or
how racial assumptions was being placed in our life.
sure. Sure. Well, I don't know about in terms of Chat GPT and AI, though certainly it's there. It's certainly there in, if nothing else, in the way in which that technology is trained. Because where is it trained but in Africa with lots of people who are being paid next to nothing? It's also trained not to be overtly racist in the ways that we are, which leads one to imagine that if left on its own, it's simply repeating who we are ourselves. So of course it's going to be as racist and homophobic and the like as we are. So it's kind of interesting that we would want to constrain it while we don't constrain ourselves to that same degree. I would actually look more like things like facial recognition, right? And how lots of assumptions were put into that, which meant that it couldn't be used. It didn't recognize Black people. It didn't, it didn't recognize anybody except white Europeans. It's all it's been trained on, and it was unable to distinguish anything else, which might be a good thing. It might not be a bad thing that it was unable to do that. But I think I don't think that the AI will necessarily move us away from any of the assumptions that we already have, partly because AI is simply generated out of the assumptions that we already, have. So I don't know if I answered your question.
There's some interesting stuff I saw this week comparing, like, asking the same question about Palestine and about Israel in ChatGPT, and you get some pretty wild stuff that's quite illustrative in that respect.
Really? Oh, I'd love to see that. Yeah. Okay.
Other questions?
I could go back to all those nice people before that we saw way at the beginning, because like I said, I will put these on the slides online for you, and you can check them all out.
Yeah, these slides are incredible. Anybody else?
No?
Questions for
Yeah. So originally with Pliny, we have this idea that like the natural varieties of humans aren't inherently negative, and then as time goes on, we have this idea that like the variety of humans must be like hierarchical, that they can't just be different, they must be different because one is better than the other. So I guess I'm wondering, like, how did we corrupt the idea of variety into being something hierarchical?
Well, I think that actually has to do with the different social circumstances of the time. This later work is being done very much in the context of colonialism and imperialism, and in the context of slavery. Obviously in the United States, slavery was, a central part of Roman society, but their kind of slavery was different from ours. It wasn't based on sort of racial, any ideas of race. Anyone could become a slave, and anyone could be emancipated into being a citizen too, if depending on the circumstances and the slaveholder and the like. I think that with the enormous variety of plants and animals that were being imported into Europe, and people as well, and were being shifted around, and the justification for why they're able to do that, sort of thing, is very much key to that idea of that view that variety becomes something bad, or something that could be arranged in this hierarchical way. Also with Pliny, the world isn't fixed. Even though he has this stoic thing of like, yes, it's one big totality and God creates it all, but it looks like it's infinite and it looks this way, and and he's dealing with appearances. He doesn't have this idea of fixity that would allow you to classify things in that way and to arrange a hierarchy of beings. Like lots of different kinds of people are Roman. So almost like, well, so why couldn't any of these people also be Roman? There's no big deal about that. Oh, poor child, is crying over there. But I would certainly point it there. And in terms of colonialism, imperialism, and slavery, I'd also say that the baby's distracting me by crying. So that's okay. I'm sorry you're not feeling well. I think if you look at something like Linnaeus' own work, I think it's kind of illustrates this, that he spent a great deal of time trying to import plants from outside of Sweden into Sweden and acclimate them. So like Sweden should be able to grow its own coffee. Why shouldn't it grow its own coffee? If we just get these plants and we train them to grow in Sweden, then we don't have to, like Britain and the rest can have their colonial things. We've got everything we need. And so he works really hard to try to acclimate all these different varieties of plants there. So even in his own work, he's very much acknowledging that, yes, there's this worldwide, movement going on. He also sends out many, many students to collect specimens for him and to send them back. And they travel, they're called Linnaeus' apostles, like by this, which is kind of interesting. It's like Jesus had his, but Linnaeus had his own. And so he sends these people out. A lot of them are his PhD students or his doctorate students. So apparently at the time when you wrote your doctorate with him, he dictated your doctorate to you and you wrote it down. Like that's, so his students' work is really his in a large extent, but he sends them out to collect and to send things back. Many of them die in the process, and like it just because it's 1780, and that's just what happens. But more often than not, but he himself is taking advantage of these aspects of this, the opening up of the new world and of other parts of the globe. And again, going to imperialism and colonialism, when he dies, he has this huge collection, obviously. The British send a couple of ships to steal it. So there are two Linnaean societies, one's in London and one's in Sweden, because the British go and steal a bunch of it, and they're on very fast ships, and they outrun the Swedish Navy to get it back to the UK. And then, so they have a huge collection there. So the British are thinking, this collection is of such immense importance for our own colonial endeavors and scientific endeavors, we have to just go and steal it. And so they did. See, there are lots of good stories, man. It's not just Pliny. There's a lot. One thing in reading these things is that and doing this work is you find all of these remarkable stories that you just kind of set aside and hope that one day, like, you can go back to it. You know, but they're certainly there. So yeah. Does that answer your question? Okay. You want?
Anybody else, either on Zoom or here? I can ask one, but I want to make sure that nobody else has anything first.
I overwhelmed everyone too.
there's like so much interesting stuff here. It's hard to know what to address specifically. But I guess I'd like to try and tie this back to a few of the things that we've been talking about here in the course over the last couple of weeks, and in particular, thinking a little bit about your characterization of the context in which race has to be developed, right? As the utility of this system of hierarchy and class and systemic classification. So, and in particular, we've been looking a little bit at Marx and Foucault the last few weeks, but also, so you get the sense that there's this materialist bent to the story, right, where we're looking at sort of, in some respect, the economic and social incentivization of this classificatory system that co-develops with it. But also in the more recent piece that you sent around, there's a passage here that hopefully will have rung some Foucault bells for people, since we just did history of sexuality last week, where you say, race is taken to be something internal and personal that's always being expressed in everyday life. It is that which is always speaking and demands that we speak. The constant production of race as an object of knowledge reproduces race as a source of solidarity, identity, authority, consciousness, and authenticity. And so, you can hear echoes there, hopefully, of part of the way that Foucault's talking about sex. So I guess the question here is, if we understand race as this, sort of problematic historical category, similar to the way you were talking about indigeneity, right? What does that mean politically for struggles for racial justice, et cetera, right? Does that mean that these are sort of confused in some way about what they're pushing for? I'd love to hear you say a little bit more about how you think about the sort of like practical implications of the argument.
Sure. And yeah, there's I admit to a strong cultian influence in my work. Absolutely, it does fall into question of critique of some aspects of even civil rights movements and the like, because and identity politics, because it does rest very much so on a certain idea of fixity as well, and I think that's deeply problematic, though the struggle that people are undertaking isn't, by any means. I also think that it's kind of unavoidable, given what you're struggling against and in the context you're in, to kind of say, to say, yes, we have these fixed identities and we have these racial, types. What was it? Stuart Hall said something like, there's sort of tactical appreciation of these differences, but you strategically, in general, you go like, no, that's just absolutely wrong. But in the moment, in the tactics of the moment, you might really want to use like these ideas. So absolutely, I think that while problematic, they shouldn't prevent people from engaging in these types of struggle. So I grew up in South Carolina at the tail end of segregation. So I actually was in segregated schools until I was in the third grade. My schools weren't desegregated until then, or integrated, as they said. And so I saw lots and lots of things, and my family was very much involved in the civil rights movement in that area. So there is a certain solidarity that comes from that understanding that we're all alike. But it was always coupled with a kind of universalism. After, like, the idea was that, yeah, we're involved in a struggle, but it's a universal struggle for everyone's sort of emancipation. And I think those two things have to be held together, because if it just becomes, well, I have my people and we're going to struggle for our freedom, then you'll probably end up not really struggling for your freedom. And, you know, and to be Foucaultian again, because, yeah, I'm totally influenced by years and years of reading him. You know, you emancipate yourself from one regime of power and domination only to find yourself in a new one with just different structures. So it's not like you're going to be able to escape that. But certainly we can argue that some are more preferable than others, right? And you know, it's a hard question, because on the one hand, like in that article, I was very critical of critical race theory, but not so much of how it was when it started, you know, when the sort of law journal review thing, but in this sort of expansion of it to everything is critical race theory. If you're mentioning race, it must be critical race theory then. And it's like, I don't think that's really true. And that's really helpful in actually the struggle for that, you know, emancipation then. So yeah, but it's a fraught issue that I often deal with. And sometimes in doing some of the work I do, I find things and I just go like, yeah, I'm not going to mention that whatsoever. I'm not going to have anything to do. That's a whole other side of these things I want to. So I did the article on, and I addressed critical race theory, but I didn't want to criticize what it was seeking to do. I think I was trying to be more critical of people who would attach their own particular political agendas to it and then try to redefine it as being about their political agenda. So yeah, and then I shouldn't say anything more. I'll just get into trouble. I'll think something bad.
It is being recorded, I guess.
Yeah. I don't care.
Yeah. Good. Any follow-ups or?
No. Yeah. Okay. All right. Great. Thanks everybody online.
Thank you so much. This is really fantastic,
Great.
and really appreciate you taking the time to come talk to us about this and share your research.
Great, thanks. Like I said, this gave me the chance to think about this stuff in a different way. So I hadn't really thought about it in terms of social change, and especially in terms of monsters and monstrosity and social change at this particular time period. So I think it might end up one day that I do a little bit more. I try to make this. So then I'll let you all know if I add more to this. No. Okay. Cool.
Yeah,
Thanks.
I'll just say, likewise for me, you know, we've been talking about monstrosity largely as, you know, sort of pejorative category that's mobilized in various ways. But I was intrigued here that there's sort of like an interesting kind of countercurrent in some ways as well, right? Where like the Pliny system is like they're leftovers of it that make their way into the racial regime, but it's also like in and of itself, sort of, in some ways almost like a celebration of the diversity of forms. So I think that's really quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, great.
Anyway,
Okay,
thank you
thanks.
again.
Okay. I'll pack up.
We have now a 10-minute break for those of you who are coming back. And the people online also, thank you, Rick. Martin says, super interesting, thank you. So